this morning. Hopefully you will get something out looking at assessment for learning. So most of you, of course, will be aware of assessment, and most of the assessment is to do with providing students with exam grades, either internally for tracking tests, end of year exams, depending on obviously how the system works back home for you guys, some sort of public exam as well. You know, particularly as these students get older, obviously exams get more important in terms of what will dictate their future life. As a result of that, assessment is what we would say a high stakes issue, as we can judge students, staff, departments, and whole schools on their exam results. And therefore, increasingly is a cause of controversy. It creates anxiety for students, parents, staff, the whole school, really. But what I want to look at is, rather than the assessment of learning, so the assessment which has taken place, is how we can nurture assessment for learning. And assessment for learning is where students can use the information, identify their strengths and weaknesses of their existing work with a view to making some sort of improvement. And therefore it involves the students, rather than us as teachers, taking more of a lead for their learning and taking greater ownership for what they do and how they progress as they go through the school, as they go through the syllabus. Obviously, with any sort of strategy in teaching, it is not a quick fix. And obviously, what I will talk to you this morning will give you some sort of strategies as to how you might embed more assessment for learning in your lessons. But the crucial thing is, it will take time. You will need to train your students in how to go about this. So please don't be disheartened. I will share some of the strategies I've used with my groups, some of the pitfalls I've encountered, so hopefully you can learn from my errors as I've gone through this with my GCSE and A-level pupils over the last few years. But as I say, the crucial message is be patient, stick with it. It will work, but it might not work the first time round. So the main thing to be aware of is summative assessment is assessment of learning, what has already happened, whereas this idea of formative assessment is the assessment for learning in terms of how students can move their learning forward and make improvements to their grades or their attainment.
Adam, sorry to interrupt. Do you have a screen share?
Yes, I can screen share with you. Yeah.
Yeah, go for it.
So just bear with me a second. So hopefully you can see that on the screen.
Yes.
Yeah. Lovely. So I'll talk through a few key ideas, focusing on self-assessment first of all. So what I will do is I'll go through each strategy. I'll give you a bit of a blurb as to how it works, and then some of the things you may want to be aware of if you want to implement this in your own classrooms back home. So self-assessment essentially involves students identifying their work and making judgments themselves as to how well or not they meet the criteria. So therefore it involves the learners, not the teachers, taking the lead for this. And for it to be effective, we will need to train the students into how they may effectively self-assess or judge their own work. And if we are able to do this, as I've said just a moment ago, it should make students much more responsible for their own learning. So what we need to do is, if we are able to introduce self-assessment, the benefits are that students should take more pride in their own work. Not only are they producing that work, but if they are then judging that work themselves, they tend to spend that little bit longer making sure it's done to a good standard and it's something which they can be proud of. However, a word of warning with it, it can be damaging to their confidence if it's not done in a constructive manner as students, some of them are naturally very good at judging their own work. Some of them, if they lack confidence, if they have self-esteem issues, can find it can be detrimental to their self-confidence. So therefore, from our point of view as educators, we need to be sensitive to that. And from a student point of view, they should try and adopt a growth mindset, viewing it as something which is positive for their education. But as I said, it will take time for them to do that. Now, I think if you are going to go for self-assessment, one thing to be aware of really early on is students will go for very general points. So a target might be increase my score, or improve how much I write, improve my analysis, without giving any thought to how it might actually be done. So what I would say is, if you are going for self-assessment, in the early days, really be specific in terms of actual targets you might set your students. So you might say, I want 4 paragraphs in a particular essay. If you're in primary school, you may say, I want to see 5 pieces of punctuation in that particular paragraph. If you're maybe in secondary schools, you may say, okay, I want you to define the key idea surrounding this topic area. So the more guidance we can give them in terms of what specific advice they should be looking to work out for their work, the more likely the potential student improvements will then be as a result. I think before we're looking at peer self-assessment as well, we need to think about peer assessment where they judge each other's work. So when they're doing peer assessment, they need to be able to judge how good their work is, but also how good the work of their peer is, to give their peer or their friend advice and constructive comments in terms of how their friend may improve their work. However, because the students need to be able to give themselves sensible and honest feedback before they can give it to their peers, I would recommend, if you're looking at self and peer assessment as strategies to use in your classrooms, I would look to introduce a self-assessment first, develop that, get that to a good level, and only then do the peer assessment. Because unless the student can give themselves honest advice, they will find it very difficult to give their friend advice in a sensitive, constructive, and empathetic manner. So therefore, my advice to you would be self-assessment and then introduce peer assessment at a later stage, if that is something which is of interest to you. One thing I would say with peer assessment is, when you first use it in your classrooms, is if students have got false ideas or they've got misconceptions, the danger can be that the students will pass that misguided information and incorrect judgments onto their peers, which obviously could then damage rather than improve the learning process for the whole class. So therefore, I would say with peer assessment, you do need to still monitor that. So it's not just a case of we sit back, we think, okay, the students have done the work, their peers will mark the work. It does still involve a lot of teacher input to make sure that the students are giving each other constructive comments, and comments which will ultimately improve their learning, not only of themselves, but also of their peers. So just to summarize, self-assessment is where the students assess their own work, give themselves comments, give themselves strategies of what they could do to improve their work, whereas peer assessment is where they offer strategies and advice to a friend in their group. Could be of higher ability, same ability, or lower ability, and offer their friends advice on what they could do to improve their work and how they could improve their academic progress moving throughout a class, or as they go up a different year group, maybe from reception to year 1, or as they go through the different years in secondary school. Hopefully that gives you a couple of ideas on self and peer assessment. The other thing you could do to develop your students further, looking at this idea of assessment for learning, is, which some a lot of you may already do, is use writing frames and model answers or example essays in order to show student work would look like. And also, the real thing I think useful with exemplars is it shows students what different quality work would look like. Because I think for a lot of our top students, our high ability students, they know what good looks like because they've been producing work to a good standard for a number of years. Whereas I think for your middle ability students, so you're just your average student, sometimes they struggle to appreciate what a really good piece of work would look like. So this is where I think example work comes in really useful, because we can model, we can show them this is the standard, this is what we would expect of our top students, this is what a good and the top grades would look like. So it gives them something to aim for or to strive towards generating that really good piece of work. Now, the danger with this, of course, is with any sort of writing frame or exemplar, we need to give them just enough help to help them learn, providing the minimum teacher input so that they can work their way through the question, through the task themselves, rather than us give them the answers or give them the full solutions. So what I would recommend to begin with is your writing frame, which sort of maybe like an essay structure. If you're in primary schools, you may be breaking it down into a number of very small tasks. So rather than just giving them a whole lesson to do something, you break that lesson down to maybe 5-10-minute tasks, fill in this particular box, answer these questions until they get more used to that sort of support. And then as they go through the year and they go through this with you, over time you gradually take away, you remove the level of support we give them. And ultimately, by the time they get higher up in the school, it should almost be a habit of them. So they just do it naturally without a lot of input. So hopefully an exemplar or a model answer would help the students to define the goals, because they can compare their work to the example essay or the model answer you've provided them. But the key here is that the students don't compare their work with that of a peer, but rather they compare their work to what we give them, whether that's a mark scheme for a question, whether it's some other sort of criteria which we as teachers direct, or whether it's comparing their work to the example. So I might use in my economics classroom, for example, I might set my students a question on inflation in the UK. I give them the essay. I would then write an A-star level answer on inflation and then ask my students at the start of a lesson to compare their essay to my essay. And then if they want to, they can then go away and incorporate some of my ideas. So the idea is that they try and replicate that idea. But of course, what we want to make sure is that we don't prevent them from being creative. So we need to think about how we might give them out. So I would suggest, for example, that if you are going to give them a model answer or an example one, that although they can use some of your ideas, that to stop them copying it, obviously they didn't learn just from copying alone, they need to act on that idea. So what I would say to my students is you can take some of my ideas, but you have to develop that idea further. So if they want to use our ideas as teachers, I think that's fine, but obviously we don't want to create dependency on us. So therefore what they should do is develop that idea further. We almost act as a springboard, if you like. We give them the idea and they then run with that idea further. But what I would say here again is that they need to use self-assessment and peer assessment before we give them the writing frames, so that the students have got the necessary skills to compare their work to that of the example one, so they can actually use that essay, that model answer, or the mark scheme we give them in a really constructive way to help them make the maximum amount of progress. And then the final thing I want to very quickly talk to you about this morning is the idea of comment-only marking, which this is where I think as educators, we can make real progress. You know, think how many hours we spend marking students' work, giving them a grade, giving them comments. We hand the work back, they look at the grade, the work gets forgotten about. Great for assessment of learning, but it's really not good for assessment for learning. So comment-only marking is where we don't give them grades, we just give comments. Now, this is quite radical for a lot of us because we're so used to giving them an A grade, a B, a C grade, whatever, whereas actually the comments are what will help them improve. So the idea is here that ability is incremental. They can work hard, they can work harder, they can make progress. So the idea here is that their progress is a growth mindset rather than they've got a fixed ability level. And there's a lot of evidence, people like Black and William in the UK, RAG from research, have all suggested that actually giving grades can have a very detrimental impact on student performance, as it can limit their creativity, encourages and reinforces a failure with the weaker students because they're used to getting bad grades. They don't see the point, therefore, of why would I want to produce work? Why would I spend time producing work when I just get a bad grade all the while? And also the danger is it can really diminish or take away the student engagement. And obviously as educators, we are all very passionate about what we teach, and therefore we want them to enjoy our subject. Whereas by giving them a grade, particularly for the lower ability students who find our subjects more difficult, it can cause a vicious cycle where they lose that enthusiasm, they lose that engagement because they feel disheartened. So therefore, with comment-only marking, excellence and success are not measured by the grades they achieve, but rather by the level of progress they can make. And hopefully from our comments, every single student in our classes, regardless of their ability, can succeed because everybody can act on those comments and therefore improve their work and hopefully enjoy our subjects more, make faster progress. And from a teacher point of view, it does also reduce the pressure on giving grades if your school allow it to happen. But one thing I would say with my students is initially they found it very difficult to accept because they've been used to having grades since they were 4 and 5 when they first started school. Everything is graded, but if you persevere with this sort of comment-only marking, the gains your students can make in terms of their progress can be really phenomenal. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Adam. We've got a few questions. If you could maybe answer them fairly quickly. So first one's from Fazmina. Thank you for this, Fazmina. She's asking, perhaps you might have answered this already. Can we give them descriptors so that there will be focus in terms of marking?
I think giving them descriptors, especially early on, I think the more information we can give them, particularly early on, is really good. So I think if you're giving them descriptors, really good idea. Be really precise with them, so be really detailed, and then gradually, once they become used to using those descriptors, we can remove the level of those descriptors because it will almost become second nature to them to be judging their work against those descriptors.
Thank you. Vinita is asking, would you pair students with similar abilities for peer assessments?
I would tend to pair them up to begin with, and then what I would then do is once they've got used to that idea, I might then maybe photocopy, if you've got access to photocopying resources in your school, is photocopy the work of a good student, so one of my better students, work of an average student, and then in their pairs get them to look at the work together and say, okay, why is this piece of work a really good piece of work? So why is this getting the best grade whereas why is this piece of work getting a lower grade? Because I think the danger if we keep them constantly in their pairs of a similar ability is your B grade students tend to remain as B grade students, whereas by occasionally showing them work of an A grade standard, they can then think, okay, this is how I might convert my B grade into more of an A grade. So for the most part, I pair my students with students of similar ability, but every now and then, as I said, I would sort of show them in their pairs work of a higher ability student and get them to look at why that work is perhaps a little bit better than theirs. So they've got a target to strive towards.
I agree. I think it's also important to sometimes mix these activities as well. So sometimes with a similar ability and sometimes with different abilities, so that each student gets a different experience each time. And again, a final question from Vinita. How often would you recommend, and for how long would peer assessments be recommended for students?
I think obviously it depends on the task you're using. I would say earlier on, to get the students used to that idea of peer assessment, early on for some of my lessons, it may take half a lesson for the first few times I use it, just because you're sort of coaching them almost. You're almost teaching them how to look at the work of a peer. So I might, for example, project the work of one of my students chosen at random onto my whiteboard, and then we would discuss it as a class, first of all. So I would look at, okay, these are the things you should be thinking about. I'd be taking student questions, taking their answers, discussing it, and then sort of once they've got the habit of that, then get them doing it in their pairs to begin with. But again, I think to begin with, the crucial thing, it will take time. But then hopefully once they're used to doing it with you, nowadays they can peer assess an essay for me in maybe 10-15 minutes and give really good advice to their partner. And I could sort of go around a room, offering them a few pointers here and there, but it can be as low as 10-15 minutes before it may take 30 minutes, just because they're not used to it.
Super. Adam, thank you so much. We've got a few more questions, but I think we're a bit conscious of time, so we're moving on to the next one.
Sure.
But thank you so much for presenting to